I'll never get over it. The fine, pure joy of flying. Back when I was a kid, I dreamed of flying. And now, having flown airplanes for half a lifetime, the dream is still with me. And so what a thrill for me to find in the nation's capital, as a part of the venerable Smithsonian Institution, a remarkable building that was built because people dreamed of flying. A building to celebrate human flight, almost as spacious as the sky itself. Magnificent. Just magnificent. That's the only way to describe this place. Real airplanes strung up like toys, real rockets standing 70 feet tall. What a place. They've captured not only the story of flight, but the excitement of flight. I've known about that excitement since I was 16 when I first soloed. A lot of people may know me as Cliff Robertson, the actor or the director or the writer, but to tell you the truth, the thing I like to do most is fly airplanes. And I bet as we look around here together, the excitement of flight will rub off on you, too. Why is this museum so popular? I think it's because this place inspires as many dreams as it displays. And maybe because there are so many stories in the story of flight.
You see it? That's it. Yeah, that's a piece of moon. Rub it. See that? That's a piece of the moon.
Like the moon rock, there's a bit of wonder to find in everything here. Touching a spacecraft that's been in orbit. Seeing the size of these things up close. Standing beneath a real airplane that was once the hottest thing in the sky.
This is the T-2, an airplane built by a Dutchman named Anthony Fokker. And
the Army bought the T-2 in 1922, trying for the first non-stop flight across the country.
They selected Lieutenants Kelly and McCready, who were test pilots,
Behind the linen-covered fuselage, behind the helmets and goggles, behind the roaring propeller, there have always been people. People who knew fear, but were not afraid. The museum is filled with their historic achievements. But history can mislead us. Wiley Post's greatest achievement was forgotten. He was remembered for taking off in his famous white monoplane, the Winnie Mae, and flying twice around the world. Each time, he set a new record. But he wouldn't be satisfied until he broke the transcontinental record by taking the Winnie Mae up to an astounding 40,000 feet. Yet, in 1935, there was no technology to keep him alive at that altitude. So Post figured it out and took his design to B.F. Goodrich. And this is what they made for him. Wiley Post's forgotten contribution to the technology of flight, the spacesuit. Technology is a practical solution to a scientific problem. And though the first two suits failed, the third one finally worked. And 30 years later, one of the reasons that Ed White could walk in space was simply that Wiley Post wouldn't give up. This building is here because a lot of people wouldn't give up. This spindly-looking device is one of the pivotal inventions in the history of flight. But it took 17 years to get it working right. A young New England scientist named Robert Goddard began in 1909 the research and experiments that would one day lead to the world's first liquid-fueled rocket. His wife's home movie camera documented his many difficulties. But Goddard would not abandon his hopeful view of things. In reporting on one launch, he would write, "It was not a failure. We were simply collecting another valuable piece of negative information." By 1926, he was ready for yet another launch on his farm in Auburn, Massachusetts. The Smithsonian had helped him with funds over the years and had published his remarkable article on how to send a rocket to the moon. But when the rocket here left the launching frame, it flew to an altitude of 41 feet. Still, it was a workable liquid fuel rocket, a splendid step forward. And its basic technology can be found in the great rockets that opened the space age. That's why it's here in a gallery called Milestones of Flight. Milestones don't come easy. The greatest weight that any of these vehicles carried on its first takeoff was the weight of hope. Hope was on the line. Careers were on the line, and lives, too. When Aerodrome number 5 first took off, it would carry on its fragile wings the reputation of a distinguished American scientist. It was 13 feet long, made of tubular steel covered with silk. A dragonfly with a steam engine. And it flew for almost 3,000 feet, launched unmanned in 1898 from a houseboat on the Potomac River. One of the nation's leading astronomers had designed it, Samuel Pierpont Langley. When Dr. Langley became third secretary of the Smithsonian, it was expected that his research would continue. What was not expected was that in his new workshop, in the side yard of the institution, he would become obsessed with the dream of building an aerodrome big enough to carry a man. In 1899, the secretary's office receives a letter from Dayton, Ohio. The writer, also interested in human flight, would like the Smithsonian to send him all the information it has on the subject. The letter is signed, Wilbur Wright. Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, 1900. Wilbur and Orville Wright arrived from Dayton, bringing the parts for a glider. Their aim is to fly it with one of them aboard to control it, to pilot it in the unpredictable winds. But first, they will fly it as a kite. In the next 2 years, they will build and pilot bigger gliders, gliders with movable rudders and wings that can be bent or warped at the tips. They learn wing warping by studying the flight of buzzards in Ohio. Dr. Langley also studies the flight of birds, and the government has put $50,000 into his project. 1902. By the end of the season, the summer visitors to Kitty Hawk have made thousands of manned but unpowered flights. 1903. Back on the Potomac, Langley's aerodrome is almost ready. Charles Manley, the engineer, is designated as pilot. Manley's never been off the ground. With their engine installed, the Wrights flip a coin to see who goes first. October 3, 1903. Langley's staff prepares the man-carrying aerodrome for takeoff. Reporters and rowboats have been waiting for months. The Washington Post said it simply slid into the water like a handful of mortar. 2 months later, Manley is ready to try again. Once again, disaster. It was the bitter end of a prominent public dream. Nine days later, without a single reporter on hand. Orville Wright flies. The brothers from Dayton, Ohio had finally found that path into the sky.
There you have the elements of flight, the same as we have today on a 747.
Paul Garber, historian emeritus of the National Air and Space Museum, understands the significance of the Wrights' achievement.
They were able to control it in all three axes, the vertical and the horizontal and the longitudinal lateral. And with those three, you can control an airplane in any direction. No one had had this three-axial control until the Wright brothers. So there is what the Wright brothers accomplished.
They moved their bodies from side to side to control the flight. The left hand was on the stick, and when you get in another angle around here, you will see.
To make the story of flight live for the visitor takes a guide with insight. Astronaut Mike Collins, this new museum's first director, knew the importance of telling the story well.
My colleagues here are a very unusual, very diverse group. When they were challenged to create something absolutely unique, they did it. In fact, they were so successful that last year they played host to over 9 million visitors.
That kind of success comes from a lot of work behind the scenes.
It's a matter of the total color of the sand.
Behind the scenes, a broad spectrum of research, a modern phase of an old tradition. Behind the scenes, an endless concern for clarity.
Well, we'll remove the molding.
Everything that goes on display must be accurate, interesting, understandable, and reliable, too. And behind the scenes, another great skill, the meticulous reconstruction and restoration of every aircraft before it is displayed. Ideally, when they are done with this ancient French plane, the inspector at the original factory would not be able to tell what was original and what had been restored. This one was designed by the Frenchman who in 1909 first flew it across the English Channel. Louis Blériot was his name. And he flew a Blériot. During that first decade of the airplane, it seemed everybody wanted to get into the air, and it didn't seem to matter much what for. You could take off and just fly around. Or you could take off and try to set some sort of record between neighboring towns. Or you could become a daredevil, like Lincoln Beachy, who flew under bridges and who raced Barney Oldfield at fairgrounds across the nation. And who made the first loop-the-loop ever seen in America. He claimed he could fly anything, even a barn door. But in 1914, the picture changed. A serious use was found for the airplane. In this massive and tragic ground war, the airplane was not decisive. But even in its infancy, its future was clear. The airplane guaranteed that never again would a war be fought only on the ground. The Great War, they called it. World War I. It didn't get the number until later, of course. The museum has captured the mood of those days with this forward flying field near Verdun, France, 1918. Some of the great air battles of the war were fought in the skies above Verdun. You know, if you stand here quietly, you get a feeling of what it must have been like. For 3 years, in the air and on the ground, the Great War had been savage, but inconclusive. And then, the Americans mobilized. 15,000 young recruits took basic flight training at home. and 2,500 joined the AEF and sailed to France for advanced training. But our pilots had to fight in English and French and Italian planes. There just wasn't enough time to build an American Air Force. The war was over. We had surplus planes and surplus pilots, looking for something to do. For a lot of them, the answer was barnstorming. Barnstorming and stunning. The words came into everyday use as this goofy kind of activity became a regular part of American life. You could look up from a fairgrounds any weekend and see a great stunt. To some, it appeared to be a dangerous life. But the barnstormers claim that the biggest danger was starving to death. Though the world took little note, President Wilson motored out with Mrs. Wilson to inaugurate the first U.S. airmail service between Washington and New York. The president's personal letter would be delivered to Postmaster General Patton, who had traveled to New York by train to receive it. This would mark one of the first truly constructive uses of the airplane. Yet, within 20 minutes of takeoff, pilot George Boyle would be lost over Maryland, would break a propeller on landing, and have to be rescued by a mail truck. Those early days were not easy, but the post office persisted. They expanded service to the south and the west. They flew in all kinds of weather. And on the long night flights between Chicago and St. Louis, one of the best airmail pilots would crash twice. But he had saved $2,000 in flying the mail, and in early 1927 he quit and flew west in pursuit of a dream he'd been working on. He will fly the Atlantic Ocean in pursuit of the $25,000 Raymond Orteig Prize. His name is Charles A. Lindbergh. At Roosevelt Field in New York, he is delayed for days by bad weather. Then one night, the sketchy weather reports improve, and on the morning of May 20th, he is ready to go. The Spirit of St. Louis is a flying fuel tank that has never before taken off with a full load. In this cramped, unheated cockpit, traveling alone for 33 and a half hours, fighting his great enemy, sleep, Charles Augustus Lindbergh flew into history.
I wrote a cablegram congratulating him on making the flight and asking him to give the aircraft to this museum. And it must have been one of the first things that Lindbergh received when he woke up the next morning after a 10-hour sleep.
In later years, he would say of this moment, "I could hardly have been more amazed if I had landed on another planet instead of the city of Paris." Yet, through all the endless hoopla, Lindy kept his head. He also kept the promise he had made to Paul Garber and the Smithsonian about the spirit of St. Louis. Charles Lindbergh made American aviation respectable, and he was a leader in making it commercial, but also he had an effect on spaceflight. There's a link between the spirit of St. Louis and the Goddard rocket, a link that most people have never heard of. You see, by 1928, the fire chief of Worcester, Massachusetts was saying that Robert Goddard's fiery rockets were a public danger, and he demanded that such tests be banned from the Commonwealth. Well, Professor Goddard had to get out. He needed help, and he got it. He got it from Lindbergh, who was now a member of the board of the Guggenheim Fund for the Promotion of Aeronautics. The Mescalero Ranch, they called it. The place where Robert Goddard of Massachusetts became a Westerner. New Mexico is just right for Goddard. There was no fire chief to complain when he put up a 60-foot launch tower. There was no public danger if a fiery rocket blew up on the pad. Goddard could finally work on a scale that matched his old dream. By 1935, his A-series rockets were traveling at a speed of 700 miles an hour, up to an altitude of 7,000 feet. 7,000 miles to the east, on the shores of the Baltic Sea, another group of men pursued a parallel technology. At Peenemünde, the Germans were working with characteristic intensity to develop their own rocket technology. Peenemünde wasn't much like the Mescalero Ranch. It was an industrial research center with a staff of 1,800, under the direction of a young engineer named Wernher von Braun. In later years, von Braun would be quoted as saying, "Until 1936, Goddard was ahead of all of us." Von Braun wrote of sending rockets to the moon. But the products of Peenemünde would land much closer than the moon, on England. This was a less threatening German product of the 30s. To many, it seemed promising. The dirigible, or Zeppelin. They had always been big, but at 803 feet, the Hindenburg was the biggest of them all. In the National Air and Space Museum, there's a reproduction of her control cabin. The helmsman stood ready to turn her to port or starboard. The other steersman maneuvered the great elevators to help change altitude and keep her in level flight. And a transatlantic voyage on this ship seemed to point a graceful way into the future. The only thing forbidden was smoking outside of the smoking room. The ship was kept aloft by 7 million cubic feet of explosive hydrogen, and it was, in fact, a great floating bomb. The famous accident at Lakehurst, New Jersey was never explained. But the image was etched in the public eye forever. The end of the old dream of Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin. It seemed to be a time of tragedy from the sky. Only a few weeks later, in the far western Pacific, the mysterious disappearance of a plane, pilot, and navigator on a record-breaking flight. The pilot, Amelia Earhart. In just a few years, she had become one of the most famous women in the world. Admired because of her ambition, her flying skill, and her courage, she made the point that aviation was going to be for women as well as for men. This is that famous plane in which Earhart flew across the Atlantic, then across the country. This is a sister ship to Wiley Post's Winnie Mae, also a Vega, made by a little company started out in California called Lockheed. No more linen stretched over a frame like the World Cruiser. No, the Vega was a plywood shell formed in 2 streamlined halves and then bonded together under 150 tons of pressure. Strength came from the skin itself. A revolutionary design by a young man named Jack Northrop. A few years later, when Northrop left Lockheed to form his own company, he came up with another pioneering design, the Northrop Alpha. The Alpha was a Vega with a low wing instead of a high wing. Northrop made it of metal instead of wood. And it became a prime inspiration for all later transport planes. They would all be low wing, all metal, stressed skin monoplanes. And none would become more famous than Donald Douglas's DC-3. The DC-3 was comfortable and profitable. The first plane ever to make a profit just by carrying passengers. Altogether, 13,000 DC-3s were built. By 1939, they were carrying more of the world's air passengers than any other plane. It was, without question, one of the best aircraft ever manufactured. And when we found ourselves facing another war, the trusty DC-3 was ready for another role. It would become the C-47 transport, the workhorse of World War II. In this war, the airplane was no longer of secondary importance. Tactically and strategically, no move could be made that did not take into consideration air power. This time, our pilots did fly and fight in American planes. An entire industry was built almost overnight to turn out hundreds of thousands of them. Bombers, flying in close formation and protected by fighters, rained decisive destruction from the sky. It was indeed an air war. 10,000 feet up, with flak bursting everywhere on the other side of these fragile walls. A Martin B-26 Marauder on a bombing run over Frankfurt, Germany. For years, this seat was surrounded by screaming danger. This is the famous Martin B-26 bomber called flak bait. Up forward sat the men who guided her through 180,000 miles of combat flying. They flew her through more missions over Europe than any other American bomber. In over 200 missions, flak bait never lost a single man. The crews of flak bait shared a war that seemed to go on forever. And when it was over, flak bait herself was obsolete, and the B-17 was obsolete, and the whole world had changed. We'd become an international power. We would be flying jet planes. And in a few years, pursuing a remarkable new technology based on a weapon we had brought home from Peenemünde.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. To accept a major national commitment of scientific and technical manpower.
That commitment was largely made possible by the presence of the man to the president's right, Wernher von Braun. He and his technical staff had come to America at the end of the war, bringing enough rocket components to fill 16 Liberty ships. At White Sands, New Mexico, they helped us develop a national rocket research program, working for a decade, only about 100 miles from the old Mescalero Ranch. (1957), Sputnik. From Russia, a terrible jolt that would trigger a vast and elaborate national response.
For while we cannot guarantee that we shall one day be first, we can guarantee that any failure to make this effort will make us lost. We go into space because whatever mankind must undertake, free men must fully share.
On one of the pivotal journeys of remembered time. The lonely dreamers were not really alone up there. Millions of us shared the drama. It was as though we had not been left behind. The missions of Apollo, man traveling fast enough to slip the bonds of Earth, being drawn into the gravitational grasp of another heavenly body. The lunar module breaks away from the orbiting command module for landing.
30 seconds. Engine stop. Mode control, both auto, descent engine command override off. Port 13 is in.
It was an exciting moment then,
30 feet to drift into the
and it's the same all over again when you see it in the museum today.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
And beyond the drama and tension, work.
I think that the best place here
Instruments to set out, magnetometers, seismometers, spectrometers. They would send back information for years.
Sounds good, Charlie. John, it's 266. Turn on your rear steering.
6 missions to the surface, 24 astronauts, men working against time to finish detailed schedules of collection and observation. On the last 3 missions, a lunar rover, letting the astronauts drive 60 miles in all. Only the Americans would think of taking a dune buggy to the moon and parking it there. And when it was time to go, there was always plenty to bring home. Altogether, they brought back 841 pounds of rock, thousands of photographs, and 1 million memories of a fantastic human achievement. You are never closer to these voyages than when you walk through the museum's Apollo to the Moon gallery. It was a technological miracle. It let us do in a whole new dimension what people have always been doing, finding out things. And Skylab, it's as big as a Midwestern silo. And men have already inhabited Skylab for nearly 3 months at a time. Like scientists on Earth, they have conducted observations.
Houston, how do you read?
They've gone for a morning jog.
Well, we'd like to see some smiling faces up there. If you could give
They've eaten with a knife and fork. And they've even had time to fool around. In other words, they've really lived in this place.
You'll see where they had the storage tank that contained the water. And the boxes around the side, they contain their equipment and supplies that they would need.
So it's a safe bet that this generation will think of space as today and not so much as tomorrow. But there's nothing new about that. The story of flight has always been the story of adjusting our thinking to a new possibility. Why do we go? Well, there's something admirable about trying to do what you think you can do. Perhaps we admire people like Langley and Lindbergh and Earhart and Armstrong and the others simply because they got going. They had dreams and they followed them. And wherever the great dreams of the future may take us, in the air or in space, this museum will be here to tell the story, to reveal what men and women are accomplishing as they venture far above and beyond this homeland that we call the Earth.